Benjamin Crawford woke to the sound of 100 Mohican warriors taking position around his campsite. Their movement so silent that only a scout with 20 years of frontier experience would have noticed a shift in the forest's natural rhythm before opening his eyes to find himself completely surrounded. His hand moved instinctively toward his rifle before his brain caught up and recognized the futility of resistance. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he could see painted faces, drawn bows, tomahawks ready for use, and at the center of this deadly formation stood a man whose bearing marked him as a sachem of significant authority. Benjamin's first coherent thought was that he was about to die for the crime of showing basic human decency to a starving child 12 hours earlier. His second was a bitter acknowledgement that this was probably always how his life would end, caught between empires and caught by the consequences of finally doing one decent thing after years of complicity in things he tried not to think about too carefully. If stories about moral reckoning, impossible choices, and a moment when conscience finally demands more than comfortable silence move you, subscribe now, because this journey will challenge everything you believe about loyalty and justice. The previous day had started like any other in Benjamin's life as a colonial scout. He had been guiding a British surveying party through the Hudson Valley, marking boundaries for future land grants, noting strategic locations for potential forts, essentially doing the advance work for the expansion that would push the Mohican and other indigenous nations further from their ancestral lands. Benjamin was good at this work, good enough that he commanded premium pay from the colonial government. He spoke passable Mohican and several other native languages, knew the terrain better than most Europeans, and had the survival skills to keep survey parties alive in wilderness that killed the unprepared. He also had the moral flexibility to not think too hard about what his work meant for the people who already lived on the land he was helping to claim for the British crown. Benjamin told himself he was just a scout, just providing information, that he wasn't responsible for what colonial authorities did with that information. It was a comfortable lie that had sustained him for a decade. That afternoon, Benjamin had separated from his survey party to scout ahead for the next day's route. He was following a game trail when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it, crying, quiet and weak, the sound of someone beyond the energy for loud grief. He found the boy collapsed against a fallen log, so thin that his ribs showed clearly through skin that bore the distinctive scarring of smallpox survivors. The child looked up at Benjamin with eyes that held no fear, only exhausted resignation. He was perhaps 8 years old, wearing clothes that were torn and filthy, his feet wrapped in rags. He spoke in Mohican, words that came out barely above a whisper. Hungry, the boy said. Please. Benjamin knew he should walk away. His orders were clear. Avoid unnecessary contact with natives. Report any sightings to the survey party leaders. Maintain professional distance. Engaging with indigenous peoples, especially children, complicated things. Created attachments and obligations that interfered with the necessary work of expansion. But looking at this starving child, Benjamin found that all his rationalizations crumbled. This wasn't politics or land disputes or imperial strategy. This was a dying boy asking for food. Benjamin pulled out his provisions, meager enough since he had been traveling light, and handed the boy a piece of dried venison and hardtack. The child ate with desperate intensity, tears streaming down his face. Benjamin gave him water from his canteen, watching carefully to make sure he didn't drink too fast and make himself sick. When the boy had finished eating, he looked at Benjamin with an expression that held both gratitude and confusion, as if kindness from a white man was so unexpected it seemed suspicious. Who are you? Benjamin asked in Mohican. Where is your family? The boy's face crumpled. Dead, he said. All dead. The sickness came to our village. My mother, father, sisters, grandmother, all dead. I ran away because I was scared. I have been alone for many days. Benjamin felt something crack inside his chest. Smallpox epidemics devastated indigenous communities with horrifying regularity, killing up to 90% of affected populations. The British did little to help, and Benjamin had heard whispers of deliberate infection through contaminated trade goods, though he had always dismissed such talk as exaggeration. What is your name? Benjamin asked. Osiris, the boy replied. It means new life. The irony of that name for a child who had lost everything was not lost on Benjamin. He made a decision that went against every professional instinct and survival rule, he had developed over 20 years. "You can stay with me tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we will figure out what to do." Benjamin made camp in a sheltered hollow, building a small fire and sharing more of his limited provisions with Osiris. The boy ate slowly this time, his stomach adjusting to having food again. As darkness fell, Benjamin found himself asking questions, learning about the village that had been destroyed, about Osiris' family, about the life this child had known before disease had taken everything. Osiris spoke haltingly, grief still raw in his young voice. "My uncle is Hendrik," he said at one point. "He is a great Sachem, leads many warriors. But he was away trading when the sickness came. I do not know if he knows what happened to our village." Benjamin felt unease stirring. Hendrik was a name he recognized, a powerful Mohican leader who commanded respect and fear across the valley. If this boy was related to him, the situation was more complicated than Benjamin had realized. As Osiris fell asleep by the fire, exhausted beyond measure, Benjamin sat awake trying to figure out his next move. He should return the boy to his people, find Hendrik or another Mohican leader, and explain the situation. But doing so would raise questions about what Benjamin was doing in this area, about the survey work he was conducting, about the colonial expansion plans he was facilitating. Alternatively, he could bring Osiris to the colonial settlement and see if missionaries would take him in. But Benjamin knew what happened to indigenous children in those situations: the forced conversion, the erasure of culture and identity, the soul-crushing loneliness of being the only one of your kind in a hostile environment. For the first time in years, Benjamin found himself questioning the comfortable neutrality he had maintained. This child existed because of the collision between European expansion and indigenous presence. The smallpox that had killed his family was enabled by that same expansion, whether deliberately or through negligent disregard for native welfare. And Benjamin's work as a scout was part of the machinery that made such tragedies inevitable. He must have eventually dozed off, because the next thing Benjamin knew, dawn was breaking and he was surrounded. He opened his eyes slowly and assessed the situation with a scout's practice calm. 100 warriors, maybe more, all positioned with professional precision. And standing directly in front of him was a man in his late 40s, powerfully built, wearing the regalia of a sachem, his face marked with both authority and barely contained rage. "You are the scout who works for the British," the sachem said in perfect English. "Benjamin Crawford, who guides their survey parties, who marks our lands for their taking." Benjamin slowly sat up, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "I am," he acknowledged. "There was no point in lying. And yet my nephew tells me you gave him food, shared your provisions, let him sleep safely by your fire." The sachem's voice was hard to read, anger and something else mixed together. "Why would you do this? Why would a man who helped steal our lands also help a starving Mohican child?" Benjamin looked at Osiris, who was awake now and standing beside his uncle, clean and fed and wearing fresh clothing. Because he was hungry, Benjamin said simply, because he is a child, because something should matter more than politics and land disputes. The sachem, who Benjamin now recognized as Hendrik from descriptions he had heard, stepped closer. "You know what happened to my nephew's village," he said. "You know about the smallpox." "I know what he told me," Benjamin replied carefully. "That disease came and killed his family." Hendrik's expression darkened. "Disease that came in trade blankets given by British soldiers," he said. "Blankets taken from a smallpox hospital and deliberately traded to our people. My brother's village was not the first to be destroyed this way, and it will not be the last. This is how your people wage war now, Scout, with invisible weapons that kill women and children and elders while leaving your soldiers' hands clean." Benjamin felt sick. He had heard rumors of such tactics, but had dismissed them as native paranoia or anti-British propaganda. But looking at Hendrik's face, at the controlled fury there, he knew he was hearing truth. "I did not know," Benjamin said quietly. "Not knowing does not make you innocent," Hendrik replied. "You work for the men who planned these atrocities. You map our land so they can take them. You guide their parties through territory they have no right to claim. Your ignorance is willful, Scout, and that makes you complicit." Benjamin could not argue, because Hendrik was right. He had deliberately not asked too many questions, had not looked too closely at the larger implications of his work, had taken his pay, and told himself he was just doing a job. Ozare spoke up suddenly, his young voice clear in the tense silence. "Uncle, he saved me. When I was dying, he gave me food. He did not have to do that." Hendrik looked down at his nephew with an expression that softened slightly. "I know," he said. "That is why this man still lives. That is why I came to talk rather than to exact justice for what his employers have done to our people." The Sachem turned back to Benjamin. "You showed my nephew compassion when you had no obligation to do so," he said. "That speaks to something in your character that is not entirely corrupted by colonial greed. So I am going to give you a choice, Benjamin Crawford, a choice that would define the rest of your life." Benjamin waited, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. "You can continue working for the British," Hendrik said. "You can return to your survey party. Report that you found nothing of interest on your scout. Go back to mapping our lands for theft. You will be paid well, you will be comfortable, and you will be complicit in genocide. That is one path." "And the other?" Benjamin asked. "You can tell the truth," Hendrik said. "You can testify to what you know about British expansion plans, about the survey work you've been doing, about the deliberate infection of our people with disease. You can stand as witness to what is being done in the name of colonial progress." "They will call me a traitor," Benjamin said. "I will lose everything." "Yes," Hendrik agreed. "You will lose your comfortable life, your employment, possibly your freedom or your life if the British decide you are too dangerous to leave alive. But you will keep something more valuable. You will keep your soul, Scout. You will be able to look at yourself and know that when it mattered, you chose truth over comfort." Benjamin looked around at the 100 warriors surrounding him, then back at Hendrik's stern face, and finally at Ozare's, the boy whose hunger had inadvertently pulled him into this moment of reckoning. He thought about the 20 years he had spent on the frontier, the things he had seen and chosen not to see, the convenient blindness that had made his life easier. "I need time to think," Benjamin said. Hendrik shook his head. "No," he replied. "This is not a decision that benefits from delay. Either you have a conscience that can be awakened or you do not. Either my nephew's suffering matters to you beyond one evening's charity or it does not. Choose now, Scout." Benjamin felt anger flash through him. "You surround me with warriors and demand I make a life-altering choice in minutes," he said. "That is coercion, not conscience." "Is it?" Hendrik asked. "Or is it simply the first time in your adult life that you have been forced to face the consequences of your choices, without the luxury of avoidance?" He gestured to his warriors. "These men have lost families to British expansion, to disease, to violence that your mapping enables. They want justice, Scout. I am offering you the chance to provide it through testimony rather than through your blood. That is more mercy than you or your employers have shown our people." The truth of that statement hit Benjamin like a physical blow. He looked at Ozares again, at this child who had lost everything and yet had thanked him for a simple meal with tears of gratitude. He thought about all the other children like Ozares, all the families destroyed, all the villages emptied by disease and displacement. And he thought about his role in that machinery of destruction. "What exactly would you want to testify to?" Benjamin asked. Hendrik's expression shifted, surprise and cautious hope replacing some of the anger. "Everything you know," he said. "The survey routes, the strategic locations you have marked, the expansion plans you have heard discussed, the conversations about indigenous removal, about land allocation, about the deliberate strategies used to weaken and destroy our resistance." "I am not privy to high-level planning," Benjamin said. "I am just a scout." "You've been a scout for 10 years, Hendrik countered. "You have guided dozens of survey parties. You have been present for countless conversations between colonial officials who assumed you were too loyal or too indifferent to repeat what you heard. You know more than you pretend to know, Scout. The question is whether you will use that knowledge for justice or continue to bury it for comfort." Benjamin made his decision. "If I testify," he said slowly, "I will need protection. The British will come after me. They cannot allow a scout to turn informant without consequences. You will have protection of the Mohican Confederacy." Hendrik said immediately, "We will shelter you, defend you, ensure you survive to deliver your testimony." But understand this, Scout. If you betray us after we extend this protection, if you prove to be a spy or a liar, your death will be neither quick nor merciful." Benjamin nodded, accepting the terms. "I will testify," he said. "I will tell everything I know." Over the next weeks, Benjamin's life transformed completely. He could not return to colonial settlements where British authorities would arrest him as a deserter and traitor. Instead, he lived among the Mohican people, protected by Hendrik's authority, but also watched constantly by warriors who did not yet trust him. Hendrik arranged a meeting with representatives from several indigenous nations and a handful of sympathetic Dutch traders who had grown disgusted with British expansion tactics. In a longhouse deep in Mohican territory, Benjamin testified to everything he knew. He described survey routes that were specifically designed to cut through sacred indigenous sites and productive hunting grounds. He detailed conversations about deliberate disease transmission. He provided names of colonial officials who had openly discussed genocide as expedient policy. The testimony was documented by a Dutch clerk who had once worked for the colonial government and had his own reasons for opposing British expansion. This documentation would be sent to authorities in Holland, to sympathetic parties in the British Parliament, to anyone who might have the power and willingness to investigate. Benjamin knew his testimony alone would not stop the expansion, would not prevent the eventual displacement of indigenous peoples from the Hudson Valley. The forces arrayed against them were too powerful, too determined, too backed by the economic and military might of European empires. But perhaps it could slow things down, create complications, save some lives. Osiris became Benjamin's constant companion during this time. The boy had attached himself to Benjamin with the fierce loyalty that traumatized children sometimes showed toward those who showed them kindness. Hendrik allowed this, perhaps seeing benefit in his nephew learning English and European ways from someone who had chosen to betray his own people for justice. One evening, as Benjamin and Osiris sat by a fire in the longhouse, the boy asked a question that cut to the heart of everything. "Why did you help me?" he said. "You could have walked past. You could have pretended not to see me. No one would have known." Benjamin considered how to answer honestly. "Because I have spent 20 years seeing things and pretending not to see them," he said finally, "seeing injustice and telling myself it was not my problem, seeing suffering and convincing myself there was nothing I could do. When I saw you, starving and alone, something in me could not pretend anymore. You were too real, too immediate, too impossible to ignore. But you lost everything to help me," Osiris said. "Your job, your home, your people. Was I worth that?" Benjamin put his hand on the boy's thin shoulder. "You were worth remembering that I am supposed to be a human being," he said. "Not just a tool for colonial expansion. Not just someone following orders and collecting pay. Your hunger reminded me that I have a soul, and that soul was dying from years of compromise and willful blindness." Osiris leaned against him, and Benjamin felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. He had never had children, had never allowed himself to form attachments that might complicate his transient lifestyle. But this boy had become important to him in ways that went beyond the political implications of his choice to testify. 6 months after Benjamin's testimony, word reached the Mohican settlement that his documentation had created exactly the complications he had hoped for. The Dutch government, seizing an opportunity to embarrass their British rivals, had publicized the testimony widely. British Parliament members sympathetic to indigenous causes had demanded investigations. Colonial officials named in Benjamin's account had been recalled to London for questioning. The expansion plans Benjamin had detailed were temporarily suspended pending official inquiries. It was not justice, not real accountability for genocide, but it was something. It was visibility, documentation, a crack in the wall of silence that usually surrounded colonial atrocities. And it had saved lives by delaying expansion that would have destroyed several more Mohican villages. But it had also made Benjamin Crawford one of the most wanted men in the Hudson Valley. British authorities had put a substantial price on his head, enough that even friendly traders might be tempted to betray him. Colonial militia occasionally raided close to Mohican territory, hoping to capture him. Benjamin could never return to the colonial world, could never reclaim his old life. Hendrik called Benjamin to a council meeting one cold winter evening. The Sachem's expression was grave. Your testimony has created problems for the British, he said, but it has also created problems for us. They blame us for sheltering you, for enabling your betrayal. They have increased military presence along our borders, restricted trade, made life more difficult for our people. I can leave, Benjamin said immediately. Go west. Remove myself as an excuse for their aggression. Hendrik shook his head. They will pursue you wherever you go, and they will still blame us for having helped you. No, Scout, you staying or leaving changes nothing about their intentions. They want our lands, and they will take them eventually, with or without your testimony as justification. He paused. But there is something else we must discuss. The Sachem gestured to Osiris, who had been sitting quietly in the corner. My nephew has no one left from his immediate family. Hendrik said, I am his closest living relative, and I have responsibility for him. But I am a war leader, constantly traveling, constantly engaged in conflicts that make caring for a child difficult. Osiris needs stability, needs someone who can be present in his life consistently. Benjamin felt his heart beginning to race. Suspecting where this was going, he has attached himself to you, Hendrik continued, follows you everywhere, listens to your teachings, looks to you as he once looked his father. In our tradition, when a child loses parents, another adult can assume that role through formal adoption. I am offering you that opportunity, Scout, to become Osiris' father-in-law in custom, to take responsibility for raising him. Benjamin felt overwhelmed. I am a white man, he said, an outsider. Surely there are others in your community who would be better suited by blood perhaps. Hendrik agreed, but not better suited by the boy's choice, and in our culture, that matters. Osiris has chosen you, Benjamin Crawford. The question is whether you will choose him in return. Benjamin looked at the boy, at Osiris' hopeful face, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of himself. For 20 years he had lived a transient life, forming no deep attachments, maintaining freedom to move where work took him. The idea of being responsible for another human being, especially a child, had always seemed incompatible with that lifestyle. But he no longer had that lifestyle. He was no longer a colonial scout moving between settlements. He was a man living among the Mohican people, protected by them, integrated into their community. And more importantly, he realized he wanted this. Wanted to be the person Osiris saw when he looked at him with trust and affection. Wanted to try to fill even a small part of the void left by the boy's dead parents. Yes, Benjamin said, I will raise him as my son. I will do everything in my power to be worthy of that responsibility. The adoption ceremony was held the following week, a profound experience that Benjamin approached with humility and respect. He was given a Mohican name, Colonial, meaning protector of the small. He formally assumed all the rights and responsibilities of parenthood for Osiris, and he wept openly when the boy called him father for the first time. Life settled into new patterns. Benjamin taught Osiris English, reading, writing, and European customs, skills that would help the boy navigate the changing world. Osiris taught Benjamin Mohican traditions, language, and ways of understanding the world that challenged everything the scout had been taught about civilization and savagery. Together, they learned to be a family, bridging cultures that colonial powers insisted must remain separate. But the peace could not last forever. 2 years after Benjamin's initial testimony, British forces launched a major offensive into Mohican territory. They claimed it was in response to raids on colonial settlements, but everyone knew the real reason was to punish the Mohican people for sheltering Benjamin and to seize land they had long coveted. Hendrik called the warriors to defend their homes. Benjamin, now fully integrated into the community and skilled in indigenous warfare tactics, fought alongside them. Osiris, at 10 years old, was too young to fight, but old enough to help with logistics, carrying supplies, tending the injured. The battle was fierce and brutal. British colonial militia, backed by professional soldiers, had superior weapons and numbers, but the Mohican warriors had superior knowledge of terrain and desperate motivation to protect their families and homes. The fighting lasted 3 days, leaving casualties on both sides. On the third day, Benjamin found himself face to face with Lieutenant Morrison, a British officer he had once guided on survey expeditions. Morrison's face twisted with rage when he recognized his former scout. "Crawford," he snarled, "you traitorous dog. You betrayed your own people for savages." "I betrayed genocide for humanity," Benjamin replied, his tomahawk ready. "There is a difference." They fought, and Benjamin's 20 years of frontier experience, combined with 2 years of training in indigenous combat techniques, proved superior to Morrison's formal military education. When the officer fell, Benjamin felt no triumph, only exhausted sadness at the waste of it all. The British forces eventually withdrew, their losses too heavy to justify continued assault. The Mohican people had won this battle, but everyone knew it was only temporary. The colonial expansion would continue, the pressure would increase, and eventually the indigenous peoples of the Hudson Valley would be displaced or destroyed. But that evening, as Benjamin sat with Osiris and Hendrik around a fire, tending wounds and counting their survival as victory, the Sachem spoke words that stayed with Benjamin for the rest of his life. "You asked me once whether your testimony was worth the cost," Hendrik said, "whether one man's choice to speak truth could matter against such overwhelming forces of empire and greed." He looked at Benjamin directly. "My people will not survive in this land forever. The colonial powers are too many, too determined, too willing to use any means necessary to take what they want. But because of you, because of your testimony, there is now documentation of what was done to us. There are records that cannot be erased. Future generations will know that we did not simply vanish, did not go quietly. They will know that we fought, that we had allies, that some white men chose justice over complicity." He paused, then continued, "And more immediately, you saved my nephew. You gave him a family when he had lost everything. You taught him that the world, despite all its cruelty, still contains people capable of compassion. That lesson alone makes your choice worth whatever it cost." Benjamin looked at Osiris, at his son, and felt peace settle over him. He had lost his old life, his comfortable position between worlds, his freedom from attachment and responsibility. But he had gained something infinitely more valuable. He had gained his conscience back. He had gained a family. He had gained the ability to look at himself without shame. Years later, when Osiris was a young man, Benjamin would tell him the full story of their first meeting, about the starving boy he almost walked past, about the simple act of sharing food that changed everything, about the choice between comfortable complicity and difficult truth. And Osiris would tell his own children, Benjamin's grandchildren, about the white scout who chose to be their grandfather, who taught them that honor sometimes requires betraying everything you once believed, that family is built through choice as much as blood, and that the most important battles are not won with weapons, but with the courage to choose compassion when hatred would be easier. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that our choices matter, even when they seem impossibly small against overwhelming forces. Leave a comment about which moment challenged or inspired you most. Your support allows me to continue creating stories about moral courage, about the bridges we can build across divides that seem insurmountable, and about the truth that sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is refusing to be complicit in your country's crimes. Thank you for being here. And remember that we all face moments when we must choose between comfortable lies and difficult truths, between the safety of not knowing and the burden of bearing witness. May we all have the courage to share our food with starving children, even when doing so will cost us everything we thought we needed. Until next time, stay brave, stay compassionate, and never underestimate the power of one choice to ripple across generations.